every artist that's done a serious body of work, it's nice to do a retrospective surveying their work over several decades, and in Margaret's case it's 4 decades. The book really tells the story of Margaret's life as well as an overview of her work, and there's quite a bit on her life actually, probably because I found it entertaining to write it and interesting, and I think also tells you where she's coming from. So these early photos are of her home at Calliope, which is on the outskirts of Gladstone, and here you see the house that Clive, her partner, designed and built, and the property has these sheds, and Clive's shed is like a little factory actually, where he's able to fabricate just about anything in the way of small sculptures, and then Margaret's got a shed where she does her watercolours. So the book goes through her life. So she was born in Johannesburg, but when she was 3 years old, the family, which are Margaret's parents and her younger brother John, moved to northern Rhodesia, what we now call Zambia, and they lived in a couple of small towns in what was known as the Copper Belt. So that at that time, that region of northern Rhodesia, Zambia, was the biggest copper producing place in the world, and Margaret's father was an accountant. And so the situation there was that they were living in these mining towns, but they were set in a wilderness. So they're mining towns, but they're surrounded by thousands of square miles of primeval bush. So Margaret always, I think, there were those two things, industry, but then the environment around it. So it's just a strange sort of joining together of the wheel of life that she's now ended up in Gladstone, which is an industrial area surrounded by bush and the Great Barrier Reef and quite untouched nature in many respects and so on. And she's been aware of those parallels too. So she grew up with an interest in the outdoors and nature, and the family travelled a fair bit whenever they had the chance in Zambia and South Africa. So and she was an outdoors kind of kid who liked swimming and horseback riding and so on. But she was always interested in art and being an artist. And when she finished boarding school in Johannesburg, the family moved to Durban, where Margaret did her training as an artist, as a graphic designer, and she had a job as an illustrator on the newspaper for Durban, the daily newspaper. So there are a couple of examples of some of the design work she did for them. That's Margaret on the beach with her brother. And so at that point in her life, she was thinking about going to London to do further art study. But by chance, friends mentioned that they knew a chap who was about to sail to the Caribbean and was looking for crew. So Margaret was interested and met him, and that was Clive, of course, who was a very capable fellow and an experienced sailor who had already done a fair bit of sailing and built his own boat. And so Margaret signed up with Clive, and they went to the Caribbean, and then by this time they were a partnership, so they decided to keep on sailing and eventually sailed on for about 4 years all told before they ended up in Queensland. And they came initially to Cairns and then went down the coast to escape the cyclones and ended up in Gladstone, and decided they liked the area and ended up staying. So that's the life story background. Then the book talks about some of the thoughts behind Margaret's work, and I suppose you'd say that she's developed a kind of eco-philosophy over the years, the idea of taking care of nature and the responsibility that we have to the environment, both man-made and natural. And one of the quotes that we put in the book that Margaret likes is by a Christian philosopher called Thomas Berry, who called upon humanity to save nature in order to save itself. And he says, The universe is composed of subjects to be communed with, not objects to be exploited. Everything has its own voice. Thunder and lightning and stars and planets, flowers, birds, animals, trees, all these have voices, and they constitute a community of existence that is profoundly related. So I think some of that kind of thinking, and it would be other conservationists like, say, Tim Flannery in Australia, have influenced Margaret, I think, and that is kind of some of the thinking behind what she does. She obviously enjoys nature, but there's a positive message there that we have a responsibility to do what we can to save the planet and to conserve nature where we're able. So that's the kind of philosophy behind what she does. Rather than sort of do a chronological survey year by year, it probably wasn't possible to do that. It was difficult to track down all of the work. And although Margaret had a good photographic archive, we simply didn't know where a lot of the early works, say, from the 1980s or 90s were. And so it was a bit patchy, the coverage of the early work. So we decided it would be more interesting to talk about the works in subject grouping. So we hit upon the themes of land and air. So works that she's done to do with, say, rainforest and going out back. And she did a whole series about dogs, which was quite interesting. She and Clive haven't had children, but they have had a whole series of dogs and they feature in her work. And she had a lovely exhibition of dog sculptures, which were quite funny, actually. And they feature in the show. We've got 3 of those works. And some of her early works were a series on Fraser Island and then on rainforest in this area. And you can see some of the beginnings of her mature work and her style in these early works, in that as a watercolourist she likes broad washes of colour and layering of things, and there's a kind of strong element of graphic design in everything that she does. So, so by about the 1990s you can see some aspects of her mature style coming together. And then in 1996 she has what I think is really a breakthrough exhibition that's called Edge of the Spirit, and it's about, the subject is Curtis Island, and it had a kind of installation component that was sort of a narrative about a farmer who doesn't look after the environment, who exploits it by planting things that are unsuitable, and there are feral animals and so on. And the feral animals feature a bit in some of these watercolours too, like feral pigs and so on. But these works are quite strong, I think, and there's one of them in the exhibition here, Marine Plains, Curtis Island, rain falling, Brolgas returning. That's just over there, actually. So they're really quite good works, I think, and interesting in the way some of them have got a kind of aerial viewpoint, as if you're hovering above the land, so they're sort of map-like in a way, and quite bold and free. And there's even a sense of sort of Chinese wash painting or Japanese wash painting in them, as well as modern abstraction and so on. So Margaret's got the ability, I think, to get to the heart of what she's interested in the subject, and creating a scene that's evocative, but with a minimal amount of detail. It's not really about creating something that's an exact copy of what she sees. It's sort of recognisable, but it's capturing the spirit of things rather than the minute detail. And there's humour in it too, of course, mud skippers and flatheads. So a lot of her work's got sort of humour. This is another subject area, animals in essence. Cats were one thing. Ibises, there's a big group of ibis works here. Dingoes on Fraser Island. The small sculptures. The sculptural works are interesting. Margaret has done some wood carving herself, and also quite a large number of aluminium and other metal works and fiberglass works that she's fabricated working with Clive, her partner, who is a very skilled fabricator. And also they've done large sculptural commissions, such as the sculptural work on the facade of the Gladstone Regional Art Gallery and Museum, where they've worked with external builders and fabricators to do big scale stuff. So the dark side of nature is another theme. Margaret's approach, I think, is fairly unsentimental, and she reminds us that nature can be read in tooth and claw. So, for instance, she had an early exhibition that was called Lion plus Zebra equals Rug, Scenes from Dust and Life in the African Veldt. So both the zebra and the lions often end up, unfortunately, to be rugs, and that's a zebra that's met its demise at the fate of a lion. And then other works deal with feral animals. So we've got a shooter here who's about to dispatch some pigs. And then she did a series about owls in this area. And one of them that you see here is about sugar glider possums who there's a population explosion, they become annoying, so an owl decides to eat one for breakfast every day. So they're a little bit confronting. And feral animals feature, feral cats particularly. Tough has a confrontation with a snake. An owl nearly drowns and gets rescued by a water rat. So it's a sort of unsentimental look at nature sometimes, not just light-hearted. Still within this theme of land and air, outback landscapes, she's done a number of trips out west in Queensland to national park areas, and those works feature a lot. Geckos, and as far out towards Longreach and places like that. A lovely series on rainforest, and particularly the Tondoon Botanic Gardens in Gladstone. Moons are a bit of an obsession for Margaret. Gold leaf moons we see quite often. She's done a lot of work with the community. This was a commission for the Rainbow Valley Early Learning Centre in Gladstone, where they worked with the kids to come up with some designs. And she also made a trip north to North Queensland, the Atherton Tableland, and did a whole series about these leaf-eating Lumholtz tree kangaroos, and wrote a children's book about that. And more recently she's done another children's book featuring a quoll and the search for a sardine can. And Cape Upstart, which is, where is Cape Upstart? Getting up towards Bowen, I think, Bowen Mackay kind of area. Interesting environment. She's done a lot of work up there recently, so these are some recent works. People might not be aware that, as well as the natural world, Margaret's also dealt with culture a fair bit. So there's another section, people and places near and far. And many years ago she made a trip to New Mexico in America and did some works to do with bears and forests, and this one deals with a Native American legend. She also did a series about the cattle drovers of Baffle Creek, which again is local to this region. That's an example there. Sculpture commissions. She's done a number of public artworks which we've tried to document in the book, because obviously you can't put them in an exhibition, and this was a commission for the Marist College in Emerald, commemorating the first group of students to go through the college. And getting back to the environment, she did a Millennium Esplanade sculpture series at Tannum Sands, dealing with the environment and a little bit of the sailing history of the place, and as well as that, some similar works for the Boyne Island Environment Education Centre. And these works continue to be used as teaching aids by some of the educators who take groups of students there. air comes into it with the Bert Hinkler Hall of Aviation in Bundaberg. Margaret was commissioned to do a piece there commemorating Bert Hinkler, and it's said that Bert considered the design of gliders by watching ibises in flight, so she's kind of worked that into her design there. She's also enjoyed artist in residencies in various places, and this is one from Japan. She went over to Japan in the autumn and did an installation which doesn't survive. She didn't bring it back, and it's got columns which are sort of evocative of bamboo, the bamboo forests over there, with cutouts which feature in a number of Margaret's later works and some sculpture, and it's about it's a sort of poetic thing. It's called When the Leaves Fall from the Trees, They Do Not Die. In Japan, there's a kind of wistful awareness of the passing of time and the seasons, and that life is short but sweet, so enjoy it when you can. So that's the kind of feeling that resonates through that. So I think Margaret, one of the hallmarks of her work is that she's got a sensitivity to place and to people and culture, and that certainly comes out in that work. Industry in the environment. She always had an interest in industry after that early childhood experience of the copper mines, where she was able, with her father, one day to go down into the mine, one of the mines in Zambia, quite deep down into the earth, and see the men and the machinery at work, and she sort of retained that memory and the interest later. And so she did a whole series on industry and the environment here in the Gladstone region, focusing on Queensland Alumina Limited, their plant and their dealings with the bauxite processing and the red mud dams and so on, and some of the machinery and the men and so on are alluded to in these small works that are in the exhibition here as an installation. And there's a larger piece, Enviro, that's in the Boyne Island Turtleway Artscape, and that's kind of a larger version of one of the small works. So then we get on to Sand and Sea, and the sculptural facade for the Gladstone Art Gallery, which is really a commemoration of Gladstone's important role as a port, an industrial port. And the idea really, looking at this work, is that it's kind of an abstract representation of the hull of boats, as if you were in the water looking up at the boats. And then some of the symbols here refer to the commodities on the wharf, and navigation charts and so on and so forth. So then more recently, over the past 10, 20 years, the coral cays of the Great Barrier Reef have been an important subject for her, particularly Heron Island and Lady Elliot Island. She's done a lot of work in those places, and more recently done an installation which we see behind us here with sculptural works and some watercolours and prints, and then a film as well that's was taken over on the island and is projected over the sculptures. So another section that we talk about is dynamic processes and cycles in nature, such as coral spawning and life and death. Even quite early on in 1985, she had done a work called Heron Island Study Sea Cycle, which is about things dying and sinking to the bottom and then new life coming up and so on. So that kind of dynamic process in nature and the life cycle of things is always featured in her work. And in this exhibition there is at least one work, Weather Closing In, that's about the experience she had one time in 2010 on Lady Elliot Island, when she was there when a cyclone actually came in. So you could see the front sort of moving over, and she's dealt with all that turbulence and the disturbance of the birds and their reaction to it as well. So it's not, Margaret's work is not merely decorative. It is very pleasant to look at and so on, but there is an underlying thought there often about what's going on in nature, about the dynamic forces of life and death or weather or survival for the animals, or the responsibility we have as humans. So sculptures with reef themes, a permanent installation exists in this building where we are now, seagulls, eagle rays and grouper, that the university commissioned years ago. No Fish, a sculpture that is in the Gladstone Regional Art Gallery Museum collection. And then finally, I think we end with the Coral Cay or Key, however you want to pronounce it, installation that we've mentioned, with a sort of experimental element that she's been using, fluorescent paint that's UV illuminated, that you shine a torch on it and it lights up like the colours do in coral. So some of the seagrass works that I mentioned, which was quite an important series for her. And the Shetland Islands residency, that was an interesting thing. The other side of the world, you couldn't get much further away from Gladstone than the Shetland Islands, north of Scotland almost to Norway. Margaret ended up doing 2 residencies there and did a series of work of the animals and birds, particularly the puffins, and some of the sort of outer islands. She was on the main island but also went to a lot of the smaller ones, and here the cutout thing that features in some of the works in this exhibition was important in this series of work, and in this case that cutout design is drawn from Fair Isle knitting patterns that she saw in a textile museum in Shetland. And they're beautifully designed, and that's another hallmark of her work, that she is a very skilled designer in whatever she does, whether it's watercolours or sculpture. She is a superb designer. And then finally, the signature image of the exhibition, A Matter of Latitude, which is about Shetland and about Gladstone and about her thinking that her thoughts are circular, that in her end is her beginning, and wherever she's been, she's taken the idea of journeys and travels and explorations and map making wherever she is.